All right, a few minutes has passed. Welcome to the final webinar of the RTA's Transportation Tuesday series. My name is Chris Schmerlo. I'm a principal analyst at the RTA, and I'll be the host for today's presentation entitled Advancing a Regional Capital Strategy, How Transit is the Answer and the RTA's Capital Program Shape the Maintenance, Upkeep, and Improvements of Transit Infrastructure. The RTA works with the three service boards, CTA, Metra, and PACE, to advance a capital strategy to effectively make major transit investments in the region. The RTA's newly adopted strategic plan, Transit is the Answer, outlines 15 new evaluation metrics that will be utilized to ensure the capital strategy fulfills major goals related to equity, accessibility, and climate change, just to name a few. Today's presentation will touch upon these topics. Before we begin, I would like to introduce my colleagues and fellow speakers. They include Peter Fahrenwald, manager of the Strategic and Corridor Planning Division, Brian Lowenberg, manager of the Capital Programs Division, and AJ Nazem, project engineer in the Project Management Oversight PMO Division. And now I pass it along to Peter Fahrenwald.
Peter, you're muted.
Sorry about that. No, anyway, thank you thank you for that, and I'm happy to be here. I wanted to start by looking at a few of the responsibilities that the RTA has in our establishing state legislation, and help to see how this presentation ties together into a comprehensive capital strategy. First, the RTA is responsible for the creation and implementation of a 5-year transit strategic plan for the region. And our previous plan, Invest in Transit, adopted in 2018, included a focus on our capital investment needs and guided our work to increase the amount of capital funding available. And our current strategic plan, Transit is the Answer, adopted this past February, is built around the need to adapt to the COVID-induced changes to our market and mobility needs. That includes new methods of evaluating capital projects. I will discuss the newly adopted strategic plan, and Brian will go into more depth on the new evaluation method coming out of Transit is the Answer. And additionally, RTA is tasked with coordinating and creating a comprehensive regional 5-year capital program. This funds the investment needs of the three service boards, CTA, Metra, and PACE. And once these projects are programmed, RTA has the responsibility to continually review and monitor the capital program to ensure that funds are spent in a prudent and expedient manner. And Brian will also delve into the development and management of the program. AJ will further review the work of the Project Management Oversight Division. And finally, Chris will show how this overall set of work can be viewed on RTAMS, which does a good job in helping to understand the benefits of the projects in the 5-year program, as well as the work of RTA's PMO group in overseeing the advancement of funded projects. And Chris will also demo the functionality included in RTAMS and show how this tool provides transparency, and which is an important tenet of Transit is the Answer for how we plan and implement projects. Next slide, please. So the region's capital improvement program is a mechanism to fund the infrastructure, which allows us to operate the Chicago region's bus and rail transit network. And this infrastructure includes the trains, the tracks, stations, structures, the rail system, the buses, maintenance garages, bus stops, and terminals of the bus system. And it also includes things like the communications and control systems, signage and information systems, fare collection equipment, and a host of other assets that keep our system running. We operate on an infrastructure that dates back to Metra's Lockport station, built in 1853. And the 1892 original L structure for the Clement exhibition still in service in the south end of the Green Line. And then north, there is the infrastructure being built right now, such as the major construction to rebuild the north end of the Red Line, as well as ongoing maintenance across CTA, PACE, and Metra facilities. So the system needs about $3.5 billion annually over the next 10 years, but we don't now, nor have we historically been able to meet that funding need. Because of this shortfall, keeping the assets we have in a state of good repair has been the primary focus of the capital dollars that we do have. And the shortfall is also why we worked over the last 5 years during our previous strategic plan to advocate for additional capital funds. And the region was successful in significantly boosting the capital program. So I'll talk about the sources of our capital funding in the next slide. So the chart on the left shows the total capital funding received by the region over 5 years, beginning with 2018, the first year of the Invest in Transit. Also indicated is the allocation for each year between CTA, Metra, and PACE. Brian will talk more a little bit later about the allocation in the capital programs for each service board. So major federal assistance to public transportation dates to the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964. And federal funding has generally been the predominant source of capital for most transit systems across the nation. And I should also note here that the capital funds we will be discussing today, they cannot generally be used to fund operations. This is in line with federal policy over the last several decades to limit funding primarily to capital investment. These federal capital funds are distributed in two ways: by formula funds, generally based on population of large urbanized areas, and discretionary funds distributed competitively or for special purposes. Capital funds from the state of Illinois have historically come to the region as part of a statewide transportation capital bond program. These bond funds are typically authorized over a 5-year period, and they've been very important, but a difficulty with this funding mechanism is that it is not consistent. After the state releases the bond program, the next program often is not authorized for 5 or even 10 years. This uncertainty in the flow of funds makes planning for large capital projects, which take years to plan and implement, very difficult. You can see on the chart of the right, where in 2018 and 2019, there's very little share of state money, it's in gray. Then in 2020 and 2021, there's a large influx of these state funds coming from the Rebuild Illinois bond program of $2.6 billion distributed over these 2 years. And although in 2023, the state portion is lessened, it significantly does continue because Rebuild Illinois provided a first ever ongoing sustainable source of capital in $227 million annual dollars from the motor fuel tax. And the local funding portion in white also varies year to year. One of the largest examples of this occurred recently when the city of Chicago created TIF districts for the Red Line North modernization and a second for the Red Line South extension projects. But typically, the local share is a modest portion of our capital funding. And another piece of good news for our capital program was the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. And this has bolstered federal formula funds by nearly 40% and opened up new discretionary opportunities to the region. So over the course of the 5 years of invested transit, the capital program more than doubled, ending 2022 at $1.8 billion. Next slide. So this brings me to our new current 5-year strategic plan, Transit is the Answer, which again was adopted by the RTA board this past February. And as I mentioned earlier, our work in developing a plan was largely driven by the profound impacts the pandemic has made on elements of society. And to respond to this challenge, RTA worked hard on an extensive and collaborative engagement process to guide our creation of a vision and our core principles for the plan. Next slide. So the vision we created is that of a safe, reliable, accessible public transportation that connects people to opportunity, advances equity, and combats climate change. Next slide. So additionally, the 3 principles guided our development of Transit is the Answer: equity, commitment to change, and stewardship. And over the course of Invest in Transit, the RTA and the service boards worked to introduce performance-based programming into the capital allocation process, which Brian will talk about in a moment. And in Transit is the Answer, we built upon that work. And through the engagement activities of last year, we developed new evaluation metrics to assess the capital program. Next slide. And the Transit is the Answer then introduces 12 new measures we will use to evaluate in the evaluation of the 5-year capital program. And these include measures we've been tracking, like accessibility and steady good repair, as well as introducing new ones like equity based on residential geography and climate impact. So I'll turn it over now to Brian Lowenberg, who will provide an overview of the programming process and detail the application of these evaluation themes and metrics. Next slide.
Thanks, Peter. Again, Brian Lowenberg, Manager Capital Programs here at RTA. So as Peter mentioned, I've got a couple of topics to go through. They include program development, capital funding sources, performance-based programming, and these evaluation methods that Peter mentioned. So let's begin with the annual process of adopting the 5-year capital program. This begins as early as the beginning of the year. Service boards begin vetting projects to be included in the program. At RTA, the capital programming process gets underway in about May with the release of the budget call. The budget call provides details to the service boards about the required submittals and timeline for the upcoming budget cycle. In July, RTA releases the preliminary capital funding marks, which include estimates of both federal formula and state PAYGO funds for the 5-year programming period. By August, the service boards are required to provide back what we call the preliminary marks. The preliminary marks include additional funding sources such as projected federal discretionary grants, service board bond issues, and other local funding sources such as city, county, and local funding pools. The preliminary marks make up the amount that is to be included in the 5-year capital program. From there, the service boards continue to piece together their programs based on available funding. In the process, they are evaluating the projects based on both internal evaluation methods as well as regional methods that we'll discuss a little bit later. Next slide, please. Right around October 1st, the service boards are required to submit their preliminary capital program of projects, as well as the metrics that support the selection of these projects going into the plan. Over the next weeks, the RTA capital staff reviews these submittals, including the project funded amounts, metrics, and goes back and forth with the service boards and any questions related to the submittals. Changes and adjustments are made as necessary. Once the service boards and RTA come to a final agreement on the draft capital program, the team works to create a budget book which highlights the capital program and includes an appendix that details all the projects in the program. October and November are reserved for the public to review the plan and make comments. The region, the service boards, and RTA leaves plenty of options for public comment. Each of the entities offers public hearings that offer multiple methods for providing feedback. RTA circles back with the service boards to address any areas of feedback before preparing the final 5-year capital program for board adoption in December. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some of the key funding sources that go into the regional capital program. The mix of funding sources, of course, changes from year to year, but federal funding tends to make up the lion's share of funding. As part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, federal funding received a significant increase with nearly 40% more funds per year compared to the previous capital bill. Federal funds are made up of 3 main buckets as shown on the left here. First, 5307 urbanized area formula funds, which make federal resources available to urbanized areas over 50,000 people for transit capital. Secondly, 5337 funds, which are state of good repair funds and provide financial assistance to public transit agencies that operate rail fixed skyway or high intensity motor bus systems for maintenance, replacement, and rehabilitation of capital assets. And finally, 5337 funds, which are federal resources to replace, rehabilitate, and purchase buses and related equipment, as well as to construct bus facilities. So in addition, on the right, you'll see IIJ provided significant discretionary opportunities. These amount to over $9 billion a year nationwide. And the Chicago region has already successfully applied for it and received significant funding from these sources. So I wanted to mention a couple examples that we received in 2022 and 2023 that have already gone into the program. Firstly, RAISE, PACE has received a Rebuilding American Infrastructure and Sustainability and Equity grant for $20 million for the Harvey Intermodal Transit Center. CTA and Metra received a combined $185 million from the All Stations Accessibility Program to fund works at the following stations: Belmont, Irving Park and Pulaski on the Blue Line, CTA, and 59 60th Street University of Chicago Station and 95th Street Chicago State University stations on the Metra Electric. Next, Metra received a mega grant for $117 million to continue rebuilding bridges on the Union Pacific North Line in the city. And finally, CTA received a 5339B electric bus and facilities discretionary grant for $29 million to purchase additional electric buses and to fund electrification at the Chicago garage. Next slide, please. So let's move on to state funding. As Peter mentioned, the state had two big new funding sources in the last state plan starting in 2020. First was the Rebuild Illinois Bond Program, which offered $2.6 billion to the region for capital projects. These funds were all programmed in 2020 and 2021, but are intended to be spent over the 5-year time frame, or just over $500 million per year. Second, the state included a new annual funding pool of transit capital from the motor fuel tax, and this we call PAYGO. PAYGO funds have amounted to just over $225 million a year for the first 4 years of the program. These two state contributions have been significant and have enabled the region to start to close the gap of funding towards bringing the system towards a state of good repair. Next slide, please. Finally, let's look at various regional sources in the capital program. So RTA issues bonds as needed to support service board capital programs. RTA issued bonds in 2014, 16, and 18 when there was no state support available. Another funding bucket is ICE, or Innovation, Coordination, and Enhancement Funds, that are granted by RTA and can be used for either capital or operating projects. In addition, the service boards receive various local funds for specific projects, including TIF funds, county funds, and local community funds. And lastly, the service boards have the option of issuing bonds. Only CTA has issued bonds to date, and those have been used to help construct regionally significant projects. So you can see from the pie chart here, total capital funding in the last capital program, 2023 to 2027, was $5.7 billion. Of that, 72% came from federal sources, 20% from state sources, 6% from service board funds, and 2% from other local sources. Next slide, please. So I want to jump over to performance-based funding allocation method. This was developed in 2021 and is used to program federal formula and PAYGO funds. To note, historically, RTA used fixed percentages to allocate these funds, but based on this 2021 agreement, funds allocated beginning in 2025 use this method. And this method is based on 3 key principles. So let's take a look at how this kind of fits together. The first principle is to address capital reinvestment need. You'll see the details here. To that end, we use 20-year state of good repair metric to determine the baseline allocation of funds. This measure estimates the amount of funding each service board would need to reach a state of good repair of all their assets within 20 years. The proportion of need makes up the initial funding split. The 20-year state of good repair need is determined by the Strategic Asset Management Working Group, which includes both the service boards and RTA staff. The group is tasked with regularly updating the needs assessment with new data to reflect investments that have been made. You'll see an adjustment was made to the 2027 allocation percentages based on 2022 data, as shown on the slide. So next slide, please. The second principle is to incentivize faster completion of projects. 50% of funds are allocated based on the 20-year state of good repair needs percentages, and then are incremented based on 2 measures: average age of funds, which has a goal to be under 2.5 years, and percent of funds spent, with a goal of spending at least 20% of available funds annually. Both metrics are built on 3-year averages. Service boards that meet the performance measures have no change to their available funding. If a measure is not met, funds are incrementally set aside for future reallocation. The reallocation method will be determined in the coming years. Next slide, please. The final prong of performance-based capital allocation is that a minimum 20% of the value of projects must meet one of the regional policy priorities, accessibility or equity, as identified in the current strategic plan. Transit is the answer. The service boards will submit these projects as part of the capital program submittals and will be presented to the board as part of the regional budget. The priorities can change each year based on evaluation of regionally important investment themes that Peter mentioned earlier. So I'll go into more details on these themes now. Next slide, please. So again, as noted by Peter, capital projects are going to be evaluated based on 12 regionally important themes that were identified by state law, by stakeholder working groups, and by the service boards during the Transit is the Answer implementation process. Each theme is evaluated using one or two metrics. We've worked with the service boards to create a guidance document on how to evaluate projects consistently throughout the region. And if you're interested, we can share this document after the meeting. So let's take a look at each theme. Next slide, please. Our first theme is access to key destinations. And this will be evaluated using a metric with the same name, and we'll look for projects that enhance access to jobs, retail, healthcare, recreation, and or educational opportunities. For each of the metrics, there's a series of measures that we will use to evaluate the project. The slide will show these measures, but in the interest of time, I won't go through each of them with you. Next slide, please. So next, let's look at equity. This will be evaluated using a metric, equity based on residential geography, using US DOT's Justice 40 metric. Justice 40 uses the following indicators to determine disadvantaged areas: climate change, clean energy and efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, reduction and remediation of legacy pollution, clean water and wastewater infrastructure, health burdens, and training and workforce development. Next slide, please. Now we'll look at benefit to riders. This will be evaluated using a metric, again with the same name, that looks to evaluate tangible benefits and improvements to the rider experience. Some of these benefits might include new lines and stations, new vehicles, rehab to vehicles and stations, removal of slow zones, and transit signal priority projects. Next slide, please. Our next theme is capacity. This will be evaluated using a metric, capacity, benefit, and need. The metric might apply to vehicle stations and stops, transit lines, operating rights of way, and storage facilities, and is intended to look at the need over a 10-year time horizon. As noted, the metric differentiates projects that are at or near capacity versus those that are not. Next slide, please. Moving on to economic impact, this will be evaluated using a metric with the same name. It will look for projects that provide an economic impact to the region. Some projects creating an impact might include construction, major line or branch reconstructions, station reconstructions, QOD projects, and access to transit projects. Next slide, please. On to the theme, service speed and reliability. This will be evaluated using a measure, impact to service speed and reliability. The metric looks to gauge if the project will improve or maintain the speed or reliability of the transit asset. Projects that improve speed or reliability might include new or refurbished vehicles, transit signal priority projects, or projects to improve corridors such as signal improvements. Next slide, please. The next theme is regulatory requirements. This will be evaluated using a metric. Is this project required to comply with regulatory requirements? If it is evaluated, it is evaluated with a simple yes or no. And if the service boards provide that it is required, then we ask them to provide what details or what requirement is needed. Next slide, please. Next is the theme operating cost. This theme will be evaluated using a metric, impact to operating cost. Service boards are asked to judge whether the impact the project will have on operating costs. Next slide, please. Our next theme is accessibility for people with disabilities. This will be evaluated using a metric, accessibility improvements, that looks at whether a project makes a location fully accessible, partially accessible, or is needed to maintain current accessibility. Next slide, please. Next, on to safety and security. This theme will be evaluated using two metrics. The first metric is impact on customer and employee safety. The measure looks to address collision risks, derailments, and employee and rider injury possibilities. Next slide, please. The second evaluation measure for safety and security is impact on system security. The measure evaluates protection and prevention projects being implemented to improve the system. Next slide, please. Our next theme is climate impact, again, evaluated using two metrics. The first metric is ridership mode shift. This metric evaluates projects that improve ridership by improving access, speed, and/or ease of use. Next slide, please. The second evaluation measure for climate impact is climate agency operating impacts. The metric evaluates projects that have an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. This can include vehicle purchase projects, but also facility projects that include green power production. Next slide, please. Our final theme is state of good repair, which is being measured using two metrics, depending on the type of asset. For non-vehicle projects, we're using the FTA term rating, which evaluates asset condition on a 1 to 5 scale. Next slide, please. The second evaluation measure for state of good repair is useful life. The evaluation method is used specifically for vehicles. So overall, you'll see we've got quite a lot of measures here we've just covered. And it's unlikely that any one project will be evaluated strongly on every single one of these regional measures, but we'll work to make sure that the regional capital program has a range of projects that are helping to fulfill all of these important regional goals. So after all that, I'll turn it over to AJ to speak about the PMO program.
Hey, Brian, thank you. Again, everyone, my name is AJ Nazem. I'm a project engineer in our project management oversight division here at the RTA. With this slide, I just want to give you a little background of our PMO program, how it came about, and what we try to accomplish. The RTA implements the PMO program pursuant to Section 2.01B of the RTA Act, which the RTA is required to oversee the service board's capital programs and expenditures. PMO is part of the RTA's fulfillment of this requirement. The focus of the PMO program is implementation, delivery, and completion of active projects. It includes projects and oversight of all projects state-funded, regardless of budget, as well as any projects with a budget of $10 million or more, regardless of funding source. So again, to reiterate, all state-funded projects, regardless of budget, as well as any projects with budgets of $10 million or more, regardless of funding type. Through this program, we work with the RTA capital team and the service boards to ensure that the capital funding is spent efficiently and effectively. RTA and the service boards have been working on improving the transparency of the capital program. More so, we monitor the status of the active projects and identify risks throughout the duration of the said projects. Finally, we work to showcase the accomplishments made in the region and highlight work accomplished in the capital program. And we aim to do this on a routine basis, but we'll touch on that in a little bit. Next slide, please. For this slide, we want to highlight where the PMO process fits in regards to the capital programs. For this, I want to give a shout out and paraphrase something that Brian has stated to me in terms of how to approach and look at the capital program. That is, the capital program can be looked at as a 3-phase process. The first is development of the 5-year capital plan. The second is the execution of the grant agreements. And the third is the implementation of the program by completing projects in the program. PMO fits at the very end of this last phase. For a project to enter into the PMO program, the service boards must first complete and submit their grant applications for state funding. These are reviewed and approved by both RTA and IDOT. After the funding grants are awarded, the service boards finish up their project planning and complete the procurement for the project. Once the service board has completed the procurement process, the RTA concurs on the procurement and a notice to proceed is issued. The PMO process begins once there's an executed contract with the contractor and project scope activities have begun. From this point, the PMO considers this project to be active. A project is considered complete once it reaches substantial completion. And I do want to point out one thing, with this being the last phase at the very end, the PMO program is often a lagging indicator and goes beyond the traditional 5 years of a capital program, especially when it comes to larger multi-year projects. Next slide, please. So I know we mentioned earlier that we monitor status and risk, but that's not all we focus on. On the whole, the PMO team monitors status, scope, budget, schedule, and risks. In particular, the approved or revised budget or schedule compared against the baseline schedule and budget in the executed contract documents. So again, to go through these quickly, the first focus on is on the status of the project. Basically, what's going on with the project? Is what they're saying in the meetings actually what's going on in the field? Basically a current snapshot of the project and what the impression is with the project heading forward. Second is scope. And by scope, there's a defined scope of work that was originally proposed and approved. We work to make sure that what's being constructed or performed is according to that scope. More than that, we monitor to make sure that if there's any change to the scope, oftentimes by utilization of a contract modification or a change order. And one thing I do want to mention really quick is on the topic of change orders, I just want to be clear, when people hear change orders, they think of something negative. They're not necessarily a bad thing. And oftentimes we see them used for value added. They can be also used for time extensions or unforeseen conditions. But again, added value is what we see a lot more times than anything. So again, when you hear the word change order, just remember to not instantly assume something bad. Oftentimes they can positively impact the project or surrounding communities. Jumping back into it, the third element we continue to monitor is budget. Do we forecast the project budget to go over budget, be under budget, which would be awesome, or is it on budget? More so as we talk about those change orders, how they affect the budget as well. The fourth is schedule, and with that, we want to make sure every project is on schedule, but living in the real world, and especially these last couple of years, I think we all realize life has a way of complicating itself much more than we would ever like it to be. As such, delays do happen and often happen on projects. So in those cases, we just want to keep track of why the slippage or delays happen. And again, these could be anything from unforeseen conditions, long lead time items, added scope, could even be something like a Taylor Swift concert affecting the actual utilization of a train line so we can't shut it down for work. So yes, Taylor Swift can impact our actual lines. Once we have these delays listed, we want to compare the revised schedule to the baseline schedule. That way we have an apples to apples comparison. More so, we often compare these project schedules to the preliminary schedules submitted with the original grant applications, just to see how the actual proposed schedules are from the service boards. Fifth and final one are what are the risks of the project, and identify them and monitor them throughout the duration of the project. And if we can, find ways to mitigate a solution to them. Again, risk can run the gamut. It could be anywhere from supply chain issues, workforce issues, even administrative risks. There's all different types of risks, but we try our best to encapsulate it the best we can. And if we can, find ways to mitigate it where possible. Next slide, please. The PMO team here at the RTA consists of 2 staff members, myself and my supervisor, Violet, which I believe is in the chat. If you are, feel free to say hello. We routinely attend project meetings to just have a firm grasp of what's going on, but also we like to build and maintain good working relationships with the service boards as well. Typically when people hear the word oversight, they think of finger pointing and blame. We instead take a more collaborative approach and work with them to take the stance as another set of eyes on a project. We find that by doing so, not only do we get better results, we build better relationships and usually have a better product delivery since everyone is on the same page. We can't attend all project meetings, and I guarantee if you look at my Wednesday calendar, you will see 5 overlapping meetings at once. So to help us manage the projects and program, we do utilize a team of consultant firms to help us oversee. For these firms, we do consider them PMO consultants, or we might use the phrase PMOCs for short. Currently for the Rebuild Illinois program, we have 4 firms. And I just want to do a quick plug. We're happy to announce that 2 of these firms are DBE firms, one of them utilizing a 100% DBE team as well. So for these PMOCs, we task them with project oversee, and they have to attend project meetings on a routine basis. More so, they're required to perform site visits for each reporting period. This to verify what's happening in the meeting is actually what's happening in the field, but also ensuring that everything is compliant with the scope and grant agreements. After attending these meetings, the PMOCs write a report, either on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on what the project type is. The reports are broken out into the sections we discussed earlier, which just quickly are status, scope, budget, schedule, and risks. That way we streamlined and standardized the program, and everyone could actually review the reports and have an easier understanding of what's going on. Finally, we have the consultants give a recap of everything discussed in a monthly meeting held with all stakeholders. We do this by collaborating with our RTA capital team, IDOT staff, and in it, we discuss what's going on with the project and what to expect from the projects moving forward. Next slide, please. Again, this is our last slide on the PMO, and one of the things we, again, try to always accomplish and highlight is improve the transparency of our PMO program, and we do this in a multitude of ways. The first, as we discussed on the previous slide, is our PMOCs writing routine reports. Again, these are submitted on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on the project type. We also want to highlight our semi-annual PMO report. In it, we highlight projects that were state funded, regardless of budget, as well as any projects that were $10 million or more, regardless of funding source. I do also want to point out that when the readers go through that report, that there are many more Rebuild Illinois and PAYGO projects in the procurement process at the service boards, but are not listed in the PMO report yet. Yet being the keyword. To state it simpler, the RTA PMO program projects are a subset of the capital program, and the PMO report is a snapshot in time of the current PMO active projects. I do also want to shout out with this last report, we did have a significant amount of work go into it and a significant amount of collaboration. This was between our PMO team internally, our communications team, capital team, as well as feedback from our executive team. All the feedback was used to highlight and showcase the projects in a clearer and easier to digest way. Some items include new graphs to quickly showcase budget, schedule, and status. Excuse me. It also now separates projects by service boards rather than by funding type. Finally, it's rebranded, which I personally think looks way better than it was before. So quick shout out again to our communications team for that. We believe all of these give a better value to the reader so they can understand what's going on with the projects, how the program is doing as a whole, and structure the report in a more easier and intuitive setup for the reader. The report can be found on our RTA website. And on the topic of transparency, we also want to highlight that our PMO information is updated quarterly on the RTA's Mapping and Statistics website, often referred to as RTAMS. Our PMO report can also be found on the RTAMS website. To find out more about RTAMS, I'll now pass it over to Chris. Next slide, please.
Thank you, AJ. As my colleagues mentioned, more details about the capital and PMO programs can be accessed on the RTA's Mapping and Statistics website. This information is housed in the Transit Projects and Studies section, which is shown here. The landing page of that section provides users with some background information about the programs. More details about the actual projects can be accessed or viewed by going to these two links. Users will be taken to an interactive table of projects. I should preface by saying that the current view of the table is still using the metrics from the RTA's last strategic plan. Incorporating the new metrics is currently being worked on and will be live in the near future. Here's a sneak peek of that configuration. Now back to the table of projects. The table is organized by priority projects, which is an umbrella term for key initiatives. By clicking on the plus buttons, users will see all the efforts that are part of a specific priority project. The PMO table is organized in the exact same fashion. Clicking further, users will see all the projects that are part of a priority projects. And then even further, they can see the details for a specific capital project. Take, for example, the 16th Street Interlocker. Here you can see there's details about this specific capital project, like its description, core requirements, strategic goals, funding breakdown, and current status. I should note that every single capital project has its own profile page. These can be accessed by clicking this link. The profile pages provide a comprehensive view of the capital project's details and its underlying information. They also provide a map or show a map of that project location as well as benefit area. A few years ago, the RTA made an effort to map all the capital projects. Through that endeavor, it was realized that projects have a specific location as well as a specific area of benefit. Take this project for example. 16th Street Interlocker is just a control point on the Metra's Rock Island line near 16th Street. It is only a small portion of the line, but it affects and benefits every single passenger that goes on the line because it safely allows trains to go to and from LaSalle Street Station. As such, it benefits every single passenger on that line, hence its benefit area are buffers around all the stations on the Rock Island line, capturing all those customers or passengers that are riding on the line. With all of this information, the RTA last year created a capital projects dashboard to show the distribution of projects within the 6-county region. Here's that dashboard. Users can peruse through the map to see all of the projects within the region, or if they're only interested in a specific service board, they can click on one of these buttons to filter the view. Take, for example, clicking this button. Here, as you can see, the view will only show those capital projects that Metra is undertaking. Now let's go back to that 16th Street Interlocker project. Here it is on the dashboard. Clicking on it, you will get a pop-up that breaks down some basic information about the project, as well as a link that takes you back to its profile page on RTAMS. Now let's look at a different view. Let's change the view to CTA. As you can see, the map will change and will only show those capital projects that are currently being undertaken by CTA. Let's look at another pop-up by clicking on one of these links. Once again, you get some basic information about this project, as well as a link back to its profile page on RTAMS. Finally, I should note that in the spirit of transparency, all of this data, the tabular as well as spatial, is housed and available on RTAMS as a downloadable data set. So the general public can download the data and do what they wish with it. The spreadsheet right here is a tabular view of the interactive capital projects table that I've demoed earlier. The zip file contains GIS data for all the capital programs project locations. Once again, allowing users to download this data and analyze it as they wish. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening. We have reserved some time now for questions. Natalie from the RTA's communication team has been monitoring the chat for those questions.
Yeah, so far we don't have many questions. So if you guys have any questions, please enter them in the chat. But other than that, there has only been one minor question, which was on slide 36. Someone was asking about if that image was from a specific project and if you could go into it.
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Nice. So yeah, that's our Metra Sibley station. It's on the 147th Street. So that's just pretty much them building the actual station platform with the overhead canopy. We do have some more updated photos. If anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to share. If you could send me an email, I'm more than happy to send some over your way.
And then another question we just got, how often is the GIS zip files updated? And are the last dates shown on the web page, or is it the zip file name?
We do our updates on RTAMS concurrent with Capital's updates. So Capital does an amendment usually quarterly. So once we get a file from them, we review that data, look for any new projects or modified project locations, make those changes, and then on a quarterly basis, we upload those onto RTAMS. This past June, the Capital had an amendment that included, I think, 7 new projects and 2 projects that were modified. We made those changes, and I actually made an update to the zip file yesterday. So that's fresh as of yesterday. And what was the second part of that question?
Is the date of the last update shown on the web page?
It should. Most of these data sets on RTAMS have a timestamp. So for example, if you go to this zip file of the spatial data, give it a few minutes to load, you can see that, yep, timestamp was yesterday, June 26th, because that's when I did the update.
And those were all the questions that were put in the chat so far.
Well, if there's no other questions, people can feel free to contact us. Here are all our contact information, email specifically. So if you're interested in learning more about the Capital PMO programs, as well as Connection Transit Answer or the data in RTAMS, please feel free to contact us.
Hey there, it looks like there was a question about evaluating accessibility that popped up there. I can speak to that for a second. So I believe Jessica put 2 links into the chat a little bit earlier. One is a memo about the actual evaluation process. And then the other one is the guidance document that we talked about. So between those 2, you can kind of find out the details. Let me know if that kind of helps there.
Well, if there's no more questions, thank you again for joining. Once again, this was the last webinar of the Transportation Tuesdays series. All of these are recorded, so if you want to share them or review them, they will be posted on, I believe, our YouTube channel in the near future. So thank you again, and take care.
Have a great day, everyone.